Today, I'm going to show you how to make this sound. This sound uses what I like to call the 43 semitone trick. If you want to find out what that is, make sure you stick around for the whole video. Before we dive in, if you want some free samples, resources, and other stuff, check our free downloads page in the description. Okay, so this sound obviously works really well in genres like trap, dubstep, other bass genres. Now, we want to create the foundations of this sound first before we get into the FM and the more kind of fun stuff. As you know, you can't put the icing on the cake until you have the cake. So let's copy this MIDI clip over to our new bass channel. I'm going to mute this one so we don't hear the original bass. And I'll quickly dive in and show you what notes we're playing. We're in the register of F0 in the key of F minor. We're using this F sharp, G sharp, a few of the notes around there. And that's a good range for these kind of bass sounds because you want that sub-fundamental to come through pretty clearly. Now, if we jump in here, make sure you got Serum loaded up for this one. And I'm just going to jump in here and here we go. So what I'm going to do first and foremost is pick the right wavetable. For this, I've actually used the massive wavetables. If you haven't got them, you can actually find a link for them online. I'll put that in the description. And I'm using the Grown 2 wavetable, which is kind of this shiny triangle looking thing. If you scroll through the wavetable there, you can see a few different kind of harmonics and movement in there. And this is the foundations of the sound here. While I think of it, I'm going to add a bit of a attack here just to get rid of that click at the beginning of the sound. What I'm going to do is as well give it some movement with the wavetable position. I'm going to use LFO1 to do this. Now, I'm going to treat it like an envelope so I can customize the exact shape of the movement here. And this is going to create that main kind of directional movement in the patch. So let's switch it to envelope mode. Now, depending on which genre or bit tempo you're at, you will want to choose a different LFO rate and speed. I went for the dotted notes and I went for 1/2 dotted. That gave me enough length just to get the exact sound I wanted. I'm going to bring this point back here so we get a nice fast sweep up with a nice kind of curve there. And this is going to form the basis of that kind of kind of this almost like a pseudo sidechain effect, this sucking upwards. And then over time, we'll have this kind of decaying down. So I'm going to drag this now onto my wavetable position, bring it back a bit. And this is just going to kind of give it that main kind of movement there, right? You can hear the crunchiness of moving that wavetable. Might fine tune this later, but we'll leave it at that for now. Before I forget, let's make sure we turn mono on the sound. This is just so we don't get any issues playing multiple notes at the same time. But now I got that nice little crisp start to the sound. Now let's move on to the FM stage. And this is where we're going to implement the 43 semitone trick I mentioned at the start of the video. What I'm going to do for now is just copy oscillator A to B. And this is going to allow us to use the same wavetable with the same position. I'm going to move the position of this one to be a little bit different and still add that same bit of modulation. Make sure we turn down the level because this one is actually not going to go to the output. We're simply using this as an FM oscillator, meaning we don't need it to be heard directly. It's going to be processing the frequency of this oscillator A here, which we're going to get into in a second. Before we do, there's a couple things I want to do to this one to make it a little bit different. Firstly, let's turn the random phase off both of these oscillators. This ensures that any sort of, oscillation is going to be in phase and any sort of FM is going to be a consistent sound. We actually know what we're going to get. Random phase is nice if you're making leads or kind of more mid-range sounds, but because this is a bass, we want to make sure our randomness is off and we're getting that consistent start point. I'm also now going to put this up and let's just hear how it sounds now. So you can't hear this one yet. It's just this one, which is what we want for now. We're going to actually start to FM this by bringing in FM from B. This is going to allow B to modulate A, and we're not going to hear anything until we bring this up, right? And that's where we start to get that nice kind of movement there, right? Now I'm going to actually bring oscillator B up. My favorite kind of trick, it's going up 3 octaves. And you'll notice each octave kind of gets more higher, right? can go high if you want. And that gets a nice kind of tonalness to the sound, which fills in the mid-range. Very important in bass music because it gives you that mid-range interest, which you're not getting if you don't have leads or vocals or something going on. So this is a nice way to fill that out. It actually can work with any kind of wavetable, but I'm just using the same one here on purpose to get the sound being consistent. And then we're also going to bring out the 7 semitones. I find the 7 semitones adds that harmonic interest because it's not necessarily just a repeat of the core note. You'll hear what I mean. Now you're getting that nice kind of above the main note there, which is really cool. To continue this off, I'm going to bring this down a little bit more here so we're getting a bit more of a snappy sound. We're going to do the FM from B here. Now that's obviously way too much. You kind of want to find a nice midpoint. And this is where the bulk of the sound comes from, right? Sounding pretty cool in my opinion. You can tweak the wavetable position to kind of get a different sound out of both. That's going to directly affect how it sounds, but I think I'm going to leave it there for now. While we're at it, if you have any cool sound design tricks that you like to use, just comment them down below and other people will be able to try those things too. All right, now we're going to move on to that screechiness and the kind of movement, which is achieved by actually filtering oscillator A. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use a high pass filter to kind of accentuate the frequencies and give it a bit more organic movement. It's kind of like one of those things you notice when it's not there, but you don't necessarily know what it is. Let's switch on the filter here. We're going to select high 24 and we're going to add a bit of drive just because we want to make sure we get a nice kind of crunchy sound out of the filter, and adding this drive will help us achieve that. Bring the cutoff down. We don't want to be cutting out too much of the low end. Bring a bit of fat up as well, just to give it a bit more volume, because we are going to add this resonance boost here, and this is going to give it that kind of classic filtered sound. We're going to bring LFO 1 now, once we've got this kind of nice peak around the low end, mid lows here. We're going to add a bit of movement here. And obviously adjust the resonance to taste here, because some sounds will sound a bit too resonant. Sometimes you might want it to be a bit more of a subtle effect. It's really up to you. Now that's sounding pretty good to me there. Maybe a bit more drive. And now obviously without it, we get a really cool resonant sound. However, now we are missing the low end out of this sound. So we need to add it back in somehow. And this is where the sub oscillator comes into play. Now, another reason we turned these random phases off on the main oscillators before is because we want the start point to line up with this sub oscillator. And you can see that yellow line in the center there is actually the beginning point of this sub oscillator here, which starts and goes up like that. So these are all going to align in phase and we're going to get a really nice sound out of it. We also do want the sub oscillator to mimic the movement of our filter without going through the filter. We're deliberately leaving the sub out of the filter processing because we don't want it to be affected by it. So what we can do is bring the level down and drag LFO 1 so that it brings up the volume of the sub in alignment with what's going on here. And we'll get this sound. And now that low end is nice and back in there. You can add a bit more volume, so we're hearing what's going on. Now, obviously one thing you can do is key track this filter. I didn't because I liked the more consistent sound. But if you want to like play higher notes, sometimes moving the filter cutoff with those notes can be helpful. Now we're going to squash this sound, process it, and give it a bit more detail so it's a more interesting and full sound. This is going to glue it together, kind of like the icing on the cake now. Now we're sprinkling a few things on top to kind of get it sounding nice. So there's quite a few effects in Serum's effects section we're going to use here to really get that nice, wide, and thick sound. The first of which is going to be hyperdimension. I've actually used 3 voices here to kind of give it not a super detuned effect, but just a subtle kind of detuning. I'll bring the mix down and the detune actually out. So the voices we do have sound very kind of thick. This is kind of more of an old school detune because a lot of the old school detuning effects didn't have like 16 voices. Like that's a very new concept. So this is a more, what I like to think of a natural kind of detune sound. Let's see how this sounds. Bring this rate down. Bring the mix down a little more. And that just thickens that sound up a lot. Gives it some stereo width, which we really want there. Now I'm also going to EQ this sound quite a bit. I'm actually going to boost the low end just to give it a bit more weight down there. So you want that sub to cut through. Obviously, you could just boost up the level a bit more. I just sometimes like to do it via EQ. It's kind of a fun way of working. Preemptively though, what we're going to do here is bring this up above everything else because we want it to be earlier on in the signal chain. We're going to add yet some more stereo kind of effects with the chorus. We're going to use a high pass filter here instead of a low pass filter so we get that brightness out of the chorus. Bring the mix down. Bring the depth down a bit. Just a subtle effect there, right? Now that we've got some nice stereo width to this sound, we can start to distort it. Distortion sounds really good after some sort of width effects because you get some crunchiness on the sides of the signal, which I really like. We're not going to add too much here though. We're actually just going to use the soft clipping algorithm and we're just going to give it a decent amount of drive to kind of give it a nice, well-rounded, warm sound. Around there sounds good. And then we're going to add multi-band compression to kind of give it that thick multi-band sound, which it is known for. Let's scroll down here, enable multi-band. I'm gonna bring some of these bands up so it's not squashing it as much. Bring up a bit of gain. That mid-range is key to bring through. We don't want to squash it too much. Tame the tops enough there. Sounding good. We just want to adjust it so it's tonally not sounding too different. Sounding a lot nicer there in my opinion. Just nice and crisp. Lastly, we can add in some reverb. This is just going to provide a bit of space to the sound and give it a bit more of a, I don't know, room to kind of play around in, if that makes sense, which just gives it a more organic and interesting feel. Actually going to bring the bass up a bit more here. I personally like the plate algorithm. I think it sounds really nice. Just a little bit of reverb here. In fact, really not much. We want to low cut it as well, just to make sure none of that low end comes through. Don't do as much of a high cut. This is just so that brightness can really ring through. Bring the size and pre-delay down too. We don't want it to be a huge room. We want it to kind of be a nice kind of small, like ambience almost effect. Cut out a bit more of that high end. We don't want it to be too bright. And that's kind of a subtle, nice effect there, right? It's sounding really nice and full. Let's quickly turn off all of these effects just so we can hear it before and after and how much these effects do make a difference. That is a huge difference. It goes from that kind of amateur sound to something full and bright. Now really quick, there's a few other little changes I want to make. Namely, I want to bring this wavetable down so it's not as aggressive. If you use too harsh of a wavetable, it can sound too like digital and kind of harsh and just not pleasant to listen to. But having this more sine-based, triangle-based waveform is just nice. Perhaps go more on the filter too. Give it more of that kind of accentuated feel there. A lot of these sounds and decisions come sometimes after the post-processing because there's a few ways you realize in which you can improve the sound. Now you can actually add an extra layer of post-processing just to make it even tighter. I didn't do a whole lot in this particular case, but what I did do is I added Ableton's compressor. You can use your stock DAW compressor just to beef out the sound a bit more. I used a ratio of, I think, 4:1, a pretty fast attack, and a fairly fast release without making it sound weird. Brought it down a bit. Turned on makeup gain. which actually works properly now. This has never worked well in the past. It's always been way too loud. And then just giving it a bit of parallel. I just find it squashes the sound and brings out that reverb tail a bit more. Sounds really nice. And then lastly, I just gave it a bit of EQ here just to add some source to the sound and kind of accentuate the nice points of it. Specifically in the low end, I took out this kind of harsh, muddy kind of sound in like 100 to 300 hertz. Especially at the end there, you kind of start to get that weird harmonic. I don't really like that. You kind of want this low mid-range to leave space for the kick and snare. And then around 5 to 10 kilohertz, about 9,000, I gave it a nice little boost. Just really crispens up the sound. I like to think this is the crisping frequency. Just really gives it a nice kind of edge on the sound. Without it, it sounds a lot duller. And you can blend the amount of those to taste. And lastly, you can add a bit more of a shelf here on the end. I like to use a pretty steep shelf just so we're boosting the low end a little bit here. Just around there. Just giving that sub power that cuts through the mix. Amazing. That is pretty much the bulk of the sound there. Post-processing and all sounds really cool. Let's just give this new one a listen in context with the drums I had earlier. I'm going to copy over my sidechain settings, which is just a really fast kick snare sidechain. Don't worry too much about how I did the sidechain, but let's just listen to it in the context. Very similar. Let's see the two and see how they compare. I think I actually like my version better than the new one. If you really enjoyed this video, make sure you hit that subscribe button to stay up to date with more content from the EDM Prod team, and give it a like because it really helps us get the video out and people see it and all that stuff, which is good. Make sure you do check out those free downloads in the description, and I will see you in the next video. Until then, have a great week.